We have Chief Content Officer and Head of External Affairs at the Interfinancial Network, Rob Blackwell. Rob, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. We try to do our best to get thought-provoking leaders in the banking space to come talk to me and broadcast it wherever we can.
I will do my best to be thought-provoking.
I appreciate that. I do. So tell me, what does a day in the life of a Chief Content Officer and Head of External Affairs look like? What do you do?
So I have three basic responsibilities. One is the content part of it. So I produce content for us. I do a weekly podcast called Banking with Interest. And that's something that takes a fair amount of time and energy and effort. As you can see from doing your own show, it's, you got to get the right guests. You got to ask the right questions. You got to put it together. I also produce some op-eds for the industry and worry about things like we have a quarterly survey that goes out to bankers, and I'll think of, help contribute to thinking up questions and the like. So that's one part of it, sort of the content piece of it. The second part is the government affairs piece of it. That's staying on top of what's going on within regulation, what's going on with legislation, and making sure that my boss, the CEO, is well informed about what's happening, coordinating with the lobbyists and outside lobbyists that we talk to. I also was a journalist, so I still talk to my sources that I used to have to try and learn as much information about what I can. And in some cases, we may lobby for particular outcomes or seek particular outcomes, and I may write a position paper that would, be speaking points or something for lobbyists that are out there. And the third part is the external affairs part of it, which is I'll deal with any press inquiries. I'll also try and get our messages out in the press. For example, we changed our name. We're Interfinancial Network now. You said that right. We were Promontory Interfinancial Network a couple months ago. So that was a big deal when we changed our name. We obviously have a marketing department, and they've been doing a great job of telling our clients about the customers about the name change. But I was trying to get a little bit press, so I did get stories in the media about the name change, about us, about what we're doing. So that's really it. It's the three pillars of sort of dealing with the press, dealing with legislative and regulatory affairs, and then producing content as well.
Very good. That sounds like it's never ending.
It never is. I mean, it's really exciting. It's an exciting. Some of it's very close to what I used to do. Creating content is close to sort of what I was as a journalist. Some of it's very new, where I'm on the other side now, where I have reporters call me, and that's an interesting shift.
Where did you get your passion for journalism and your podcast? Because as I've listened to your podcast studying for this, you can definitely tell that the passion is there. Where'd that come from?
So I started off just getting out of college and feeling like I really wanted to be a writer. I think a lot of people feel this way. I had a background in English, and I didn't have much of a background in journalism. What I did do is I was for the radio station, the local college radio station. I was in journalism, and I loved that experience. And I came out thinking I want to be a writer. I'd taken this course in college about how to write professionally, and one of the jobs that I sort of fell into was I started out as a sports reporter for a local newspaper, and then that led into business reporting, and then that led me to American Banker. And I thought, well, I'm going to be an American banker for a year or two and maybe go up to the Hill. I've always enjoyed politics, and I live around Washington, D.C. So you either love it or you hate it. I happen to grow up loving it. My father was a political junkie. So it basically, when I thought I'd be an American banker for 1 year, I stayed for 20. I found a really good group of people there. We were covering the banking industry, but all of it was political. And I got really fascinated with the interchange of what was happening and how things were changing. I became Washington bureau chief, so I was leading the Washington coverage at a certain point, including during the last financial crisis. And then eventually I was editor-in-chief, and that was a neat experience. So I kept being challenged along the way, and it was very interesting. And during that time, once you become a journalist, there's sort of a calling for it and a passion for it that you develop. So when I left journalism, because Interfinancial Network is not a media company, we're FinTech like you, I basically wanted to take some of that energy and some of that experience with me. So podcast is part of that. It's my way of still staying relevant in journalism. It's my way of still staying relevant to the broader banking industry doing thought leadership content, exactly the kind of thing that you're doing right now, which I think is terrific. Not just sort of looking, what's the best way to make a sale, but what's the best way to contribute to the industry overall. And and this was my way of doing that. So I get to play journalist, and in some cases I get to have my old reporters on the show with me. In other cases, I get to talk to people like Mark Cuban. I've been fortunate to be able to talk to him, and other people, Citigroup Chairman John Dugan and Rob Nichols, who's head of the American Bankers Association. So it's a nice ability to sort of talk to a wide range of people and still feel like I have a little bit of a toe in journalism.
That's awesome. I haven't had the chance to talk to Mark Cuban yet, but maybe that'll be a goal for 2021.
I gotta tell you, that was one of the more surprising things. So I made a pitch. I just started the podcast, and I talked to a banker in Oklahoma. Her name is Jill Castilla.
Yep, she's been on the show. Yeah,
she runs the Citizens Bank of Edmond, and she's terrific, as you know. And she had basically, Mark Cuban had ended up calling her and cutting a deal to sort of help with smooth the process for PPP and smooth the process for getting stimulus money to people. And so I talked to Jill, and she said, well, why don't you just reach out to Mark Cuban and see if he wants to be on the show? So I wrote him an email, and 15 minutes later, he's like, yes, I'll do it. So I was really impressed by that. By the way, I think he's going to run for public office. So I don't know. You tell me if he's going to run for senator in Texas. You don't have an opening up for a little while yet, but either senator or maybe take a run for presidency. But that's my prediction.
We could use some fresh air. I like Mark. He's got good energy.
He does have good energy. He was really, really on the ball.
So I digress a little bit, but what is your most favorite part of your job? Is it the content part? Is it journalism part? What do you enjoy most about your job?
So the easy part is the content. I do love the podcast. I love creating it. I pick all the guests. So there's nobody talking in my ear and saying it's got to be this person or got to be that person. So it's a nice ability to sort of grab anybody and talk to them about their experiences and where they're coming from. And so, I really enjoy that. I will say I've enjoyed the government affairs work much more than I expected to. I had a window into it as a journalist when I would call lobbyists and deal with them. It's very different, though, when you're actually part of an organization and you're lobbying for an outcome. Because as a journalist, I was just seeking information. I just wanted to report accurately what the discussions were. In this case, sometimes I need to write position papers to help convince lawmakers of things. And that is a very different job than I was doing. And I found that I enjoy that. And frankly, I work with good people, so they usually our positions make a lot of sense and are very rational. So it's very easy for me to try and sell them. But it's been a unique writing opportunity, and I've sort of enjoyed getting to see more of that side of things.
That's fantastic. And, we could probably have a series of shows about you being chief editor at the American Banker, but maybe you could share 2 or 3 unique interviews that you had during that time that really stood head and shoulders above the rest.
It's tough because that entire experience was, I talked to a lot of bankers, and most of the really good interviews you get are off the record. So I've talked with Jamie Dimon, and I talked with Tim Sloan, who was the CEO of Wells Fargo, off the record. And let me put it this way, during that off the record conversation, I knew that there were going to be long-term problems, because in that case, and because it was off the record, I can't divulge what I was talking about. But in that case, I could understand that the disconnect, he did not understand Washington, D.C. very well, but he thought he did. And that is a very dangerous position. I would argue the contrast with Jamie Dimon is that is a man who understands Washington very well and actually does understand Washington very well. And I once saw him in a room full of reporters, and off the record, this was before he testified in Congress, and I was in the room, and he gathered a whole bunch of journalists, many of whom you would know from watching CNBC or Bloomberg TV or even CNN. And they were all in there, and then he let anyone ask him anything around the table, went around. So everybody got a question. You could ask whatever you wanted, and then he would answer it. It was all off the record, but it was practice. You could see that he was using it as a practice for when he appeared in the Senate Banking Committee the next day, because we were all going to ask him harder questions, honestly, than a lot of lawmakers were going to. And that is what happened. And he seemed to revel in it and enjoy it in a way I don't think most people do. And I think most people would be intimidated by that. And he obviously wasn't. And of course, he did really well during those hearings that followed. So that's always stuck in my mind. And it sticks in my mind as a contrast to Tim Sloan, who, when I was talking with him, and that was one-on-one, this was after the phony account scandal had started to happen, you could get a sense that he didn't quite get the depth of Washington anger, and he felt like it was a kabuki theater. And I don't think, which is a fair criticism of Washington, D.C., right? There's a lot of, a lot of posturing, a lot of politics behind, both behind the scenes and in front of the camera. But having said that, I don't think he understood just how much anger there was. And I don't think he understood that if he did not make changes, he was not going to survive in that job very long. And that is, of course, the way it played out.
Yep. And you as at your time at American Banker, you've got to see several administration changes.
Yes. You
also got to live through the Great Recession. I can't imagine what that looked like or what that meant.
It was crazy. The financial crisis of 2008 is mostly a blur to me. Now, that was canceled vacations. My daughter had been born in May of that year, and I don't think I saw her for a chunk of time. It was just, it was really crazy. I was running the Washington bureau, so you would just have these days where it was a weekend and I was out, on a hike with my family, and someone's calling me and they're like, Fannie and Freddie are about to be seized by the government. So, I had to come all the way. I got in the car. I'm heading back. And I thought to myself, this is the biggest story of my career. There will never be a bigger story. And of course, it wasn't even the biggest story of that month, because later Lehman Brothers and AIG toppled. So, I had no real sense of what was coming. And it was just, it felt like an assault. There's the Battlestar Galactica episode, I don't know if the rebooted one, where they get attacked by the Cylons every 33 minutes and they can never take a break. That is what that time felt like. Yeah. And that is honestly what 2020 has felt like for different reasons. I haven't been a journalist in 2020, but the news cycle has been particularly assaultive, and it feels like you just got one thing after another. And I think we've all felt that way, but I felt that way particularly during 2008, and it reminds me of now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of look forward. I don't want to get too political, but I kind of look forward to, a new norm that we may have in the very near future. I appreciate the stories that you have done. I appreciate the podcast that you have had. And I really feel like that you guys are working very diligent and very hard on trying to get the right information out to the community that you support.
We do work very hard at that. And I work very hard at finding guests that'll sort of add some insight into key areas. My guest today, it was the former chief of staff of Pat Toomey, who may be the Senate Banking Committee chairman. I'm always trying to find people that will really sometimes push and challenge the conventional wisdom, and sometimes people that will really provide knowledge or insight.
Mm-hmm. So as the administration changes, and us both being in FinTech, I would say that the next wave that would be approaching us quickly is regulation and compliance. Do you see anything along those lines from your network of contacts? Yeah,
I keep telling people you don't really need to worry about legislation, particularly with the Senate's going to be closely divided. Even if the Democrats pick up 2 seats, it would be a 50-50 split. It's going to take a lot to get anything through there, and you're not getting rid of the filibuster with only 50 senators. So legislation is very unlikely when it comes to banking and FinTech, unless there's a lot of weight and a lot of agreement, consensus behind it. But you are going to see a lot of regulation. Particularly, you ought to be watching the CFPB, because the Supreme Court has ruled that the CFPB is fireable at will at the president. So we are expecting CFPB Director Kathy Kraninger to be fired within hours of Joe Biden's inauguration. It's just something. There are Republicans trying to make a last-minute push to save her, but I don't think that'll last. This is something that Senator Elizabeth Warren is deeply invested in, and she wants Kraninger out of there. So I think that will happen very, very, very soon after the inauguration, and I think that's an agency that it's going to flip 180. It's going to go back to where it was under Director Richard Cordray, but it's probably going to be even more aggressive because there is a perception that the Trump administration sort of neutered it. And I think there's going to be a real feeling among this new CFPB leadership that they've got to move aggressively on a number of fronts. I would expect whoever the Biden administration picks to be experienced, perhaps someone who was at the CFPB previously, someone who can really hit the ground running. I don't think you're going to see much of a transition period where somebody is really sort of just figuring out what the job was. I think they're gonna hit it and go. So I do think on areas like overdraft, on areas like I think more attention toward mortgage servicing, what people have been doing during the pandemic, these forbearance periods. I think that's going to be a real focus of the CFPB. Overall, I think you're going to see the regulators a little bit more aggressive. Usually, when we have a transition of administration, the changeover on regulators is much slower. This is going to be much, much faster because, of course, you have an opening at the OCC, which, depending on what they've nominated Brian Brooks to be head of to head the comptroller's office. I don't know if there's enough time for the Senate to pass that. So if not, then there will be a vacancy at the OCC on day one, and that's two major banking regulators right there.
And then we had some very interesting news just a couple of days ago that Google's going to expand its Google Pay, and now it's going to partner with banks to open up checking accounts. Is that the beginning of the end, or what do you think there?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to it. It's the question I spend a lot of time asking guests about and a lot of time sort of thinking over. They're partnering with Citigroup. They're partnering with federal credit union, local credit union, Stanford Credit Union. And I think it's an interesting way to do it, right? Because Google didn't go get a banking charter. That would be very, very difficult. And if they'd done that, they would have started a huge political fight. Instead, they've taken the totally legal route of partnering, the same route that Apple took when it wanted a credit card. It partnered with Goldman Sachs. So I think you're going to see many more of these partnerships. Microsoft already has one with, I believe it's Citizens for, it's selling its Xbox consoles. I think you're going to see Google really making a run here at whether or not it can have a checking relationship, again, through a bank. There will be, the funds will be at Citigroup, or they'll be at the credit union if you are able to be a member there. And I don't know whether or not it's the beginning of the end. We'll have to see how well this catches on. It may be that people are resistant to moving their checking relationship to Google. And as you know, in the FinTech world, sometimes they've had a hard time. Millennials and Gen Z, I think, are much more willing to engage with tech companies when it comes to finance, where you have Generation Xers and baby boomers much more wanting to prefer the traditional banking system. You're going to see that tension really build. And I think the key thing is to watch, are millennials going to Google? Are they able to suck up a lot of that? When does Amazon start offering you a checking account? Because that's another thing to start looking for. And I guarantee if Amazon's watching Google do it, they're thinking about doing it themselves.
Oh, yes. And, our technology primarily focuses on the digital transformation all around the loan life cycle. And what's excited me most is gone are the days where you apply for a credit product and you have to wait for any period of time to get some type of response. Consumer product, auto approval. I mean, that's the cutting edge today. So
really, you're seeing Amazon change customer expectations, right? I mean, we all expect to get our packages in 2 days, and if we don't, we get annoyed. And so that's being translated into financial services. People want to know if they're getting a loan. They want to know when they're getting their credit card. They want to be able to use it right away. All this stuff is really, really changing very fast, and it's a question of whether or not banks can keep up with that or are going to be left behind. And we don't know the answer to that yet. That's the real question over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yep. It'll be an interesting thing to watch.
Very cool.
So, Rob, before we go, one last question. As editor-in-chief of American Banker and also chief content officer of Interfi Network, what words of advice would you give anybody wanting to get into the journalism world or wanting to get into the political arena that you kind of play in?
The easiest way to get into journalism is to become a journalist. I mean, I know that there are a lot of local papers looking for people. That is where I cut my teeth. I think it's hard to be a writer. You need you need to find an editor who's going to tell you that your writing isn't very good. And to be perfectly honest with you, you know, I came into the job thinking I sort of knew what I was doing. I did not know what I was doing. And even when I'd been a reporter for 2 years, when I got to American Banker, I had my boss at the time was a woman named Barbara Ream, who's a legend in the banking industry and actually now works with me at Interfinancial. And she was the one who would call you into the office and be like, this doesn't make any sense. And you know, you've got to do it again. Or she'd be like, she asked you a question, I wouldn't know the answer. And I'd try and BS my way through. And she'd look at me and she'd go, you don't know, go find out. And that was huge for me. And so that really changed the way I viewed things. So I think the easiest way is to start trying to find a way to contribute. If you really want to be in media, find a way to contribute to media, find a way to write, even if that's writing op-eds, but you also have to take with you a tremendous willingness to learn. I mean, I will say that the journalism faces a really tough road, just like banking does now. It's been upended by a change in the model. Digital has really changed the way things, you know, the big papers, Washington Post, New York Times, they're doing great. They're doing really well, particularly during the Trump administration. I mean, President Trump used to say that they were failing, but they actually drove subscriptions. People got more engaged with the news on both sides. But your local papers are in real trouble. And they have a real problem because if classified ads was one of the ways they made money, and now people have Craigslist and people have way other ways of getting around that, and so they've lost a lot of money. There's been a real drain at the local newspaper level. So if I were young again, I would say start there and try and build up. If I were a little older, I would be looking for opportunities of places where you have a particular expertise, and then writing for a newspaper or media outlet that covers that particular industry. We did have, we had banking lawyers want to be reporters, and we signed them up. They knew there was a pay cut involved, but they just didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. But they took that knowledge of banking law into reporting, and were very, very successful. One of the more successful reporters at American Banker was Kevin Wack, and he came from a background where he was working at the government and working after the financial crisis and understanding what happened. And he came out of that and became a reporter, and he was hugely successful, now out on the West Coast and doing a lot of great work still for American Banker. So, you know, there are opportunities if you're willing to seize them and you're willing to work for, I guess I would say, less pay at the beginning. Journalism is not an area you want to go into if you're looking to make it big. Rich.
Fantastic. Rob, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure. We'll be back. I want to do this again. We could keep going for hours.
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the invitation. I love the show, and keep doing the fantastic work that you're doing.
I will try. Thank you for our audience for being here with us today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to TurnKey Lender or to Rob at Interfi Network. We're happy to help.
Please.
Thank you very much.